Hello, anti-novelists, Lilligans, fellow friends, and onlookers. This is the next episode of Zettelkasten for Fiction, where imagination finds order, the book that I am writing to teach you how to get your writing done, get those words on the page, and ultimately finish your own book. I want to hold your book in my hands. So let's take a look at a little bit of using the Zettelkasten specifically for research that leads to a chapter. What we're looking at is the book Embroidered Textiles by Sheila Payne. This has been an amazing resource in that it goes around the world, all different cultures and countries, and collects different kinds and meanings of hand embroidery. Some of you may already know, if you followed my other videos and breakdowns, the novel that I'm writing, which I have slightly set aside for a short time in order to finish this book for you, is called The Conjuring Stitch. So embroidery plays a critical role in that story. So let's talk about how does that work. I've gotten several questions about how exactly does the research and the Zettelkasten lead to the writing of fiction. Let's break it down. When I first began looking at this book, I started with chapter, if mangling books turns your stomach, look away. I am the worst offender. I'm guilty as charged. I am a book mangler. For example, I needed this chapter, The Magical Source of Protection, so I just ripped that puppy right out of the book. I know, it's terrible, but I am who I am. I'm not apologizing. So first I've got my bib card, which is Sheila Payne, Embroidered Textiles, A World Guide to Traditional Patterns. Normally on my bib card, I would make a note here of how I believe this book can contribute to whatever I intend to use it for. In this case, however, a key central part of my novel is hand embroidery. So I don't need to write that on here because it's obvious it's a book about embroidery. So I skipped over the goal writing. As you know, on the back, the key page that I've listed is page 188, which gets into embroidery as a magical source of protection. So often I get the question from my beta readers who are helping me workshop this book through the developmental edit. How in the world did you come to that conclusion? How did you make that up? Well, in the words of Margaret Atwood, I didn't. Everything that I am putting into this book exists somewhere in the world at some point in time. So for me, that's just part of what makes writing fiction interesting. I love taking the threads, no pun intended, of different pieces of history and historical information and weaving those into a fiction story. That's just what I love to do. So if that's your jam, continue on with me. So you'll notice I've got some notes. Gilliac is a verb that means 1, to embroider patterns, or 2, to cast spells. How flipping cool is that? Hand embroidering patterns and casting spells has the same definition in this language. I found that extremely fascinating, and I went down a rabbit hole and researched the culture and just really dug into it. So I won't bore you with those details, but all of those details live over in my Zettelkasten in the cards. But this was the key ingredient that I needed. Secondly, I've got a card on how it repels the evil eye, and it talks about the rule of 3. The position, the patterns, and the materials. Those are the 3 things that are critical for this magical act of embroidery. So you can see I'm going down a very specific road here, which is making the discoveries that I need in order to write those chapters in my book. So once I have those details researched and lined out for myself, I had no question about my heading. So how do I set that up? Well, over here in my manuscript, I have a chapter that is called Quickening. And in Quickening, that's where my main character, Tara, starts to understand the possibilities of this kind of embroidery. She doesn't know anything about stitching. That's not part of her lineage or part of her family's tradition. She discovers it through her basically mentor, which, yes, that is a trope in the story. But nonetheless, she comes to it. So how does that play out in the chapter? Well, I'm just going to read you the last part of page 139. So knowing what we know, that she's taken a stab, again, no pun intended, at this kind of hand embroidery, she's starting to figure it out maybe a little bit, and this is driving that story forward. This is deepening that connection with her and bringing my reader in to root for her and hope that she figures out this mystery. So here's what the end of chapter 29 says. She looked down at her hands as if for the first time. Something was different. She rubbed her palms together several times and then ran her fingers and hands around each other as if washing with soap. It wasn't her imagination. She had a slight buzzing sensation that lingered from using the needle and thread, as if learning the motions to using the tools had helped her call up what she was feeling. Watching Gretchen return to the work table, she wondered if this restless manifestation could be controlled. What would that look like? Here, go to the chapter on magical embroidery. Tara read the author's name, Sheila Payne. Just do that research thing you do and let the ideas sink in. If I haven't missed my guess, you have just accessed something very old. Gretchen's voice became quiet and far away. And we were about to open a whole new world. See how that lands and kind of hits you right in the feels? You're rooting for her to figure this out, and under the leadership of her esteemed mentor, she's figuring it out and starting to ask her own questions about what's possible here. So that's just one tiny example of how you begin with your primary resource. So that was Sheila Payne's book on embroidery. You do the research in order to unearth the nuggets and tidbits and gems that you need in order to sprinkle them through that story so that you get readability, you get believability, you get rooting for your main character or characters, and you get an interest to continue on and find out what happens. And then you start populating those sentences into paragraphs, into scenes that show your reader what it is you're getting at. And ultimately, those scenes are set up into scene and sequel. So let's talk about that for just a second. A scene is what I've just read you. The end of that chapter is wrapping up that scene in such a way that she starts to ask kind of an important question. I wonder what this would look like if I could control it. And then her mentor says, just research, because she's a museum researcher, do your research thing. And if I've not missed my guess, you're onto something here. And then she lands it, and we're about to open a whole new world. So what does that do for your reader? Well, if I'm the reader, I want to know what's in this world. What's going to happen next? You can't leave me hanging there with we're about to open a whole new world, and then that's the end of the chapter. What am I going to do? If it's me reading, I'm going to go to the next chapter and find out what happens. That is scene and sequel in a nutshell. Each scene should have some kind of landing that draws the reader on into the next scene. Now, it doesn't have to be bombs blowing up, cars crashing, people getting killed, crazy, dramatic stuff. It can be as simple as a well-placed question or a well-placed statement that makes that reader go, I wonder where this is going. They either worry about the character because it's a negative landing. They root for the character because they're starting to make some headway and the reader wants to know what is going to happen next. Is she going to figure this out? Or there's a myriad of other options of ways to land a scene so that it naturally leads into the sequel and keeps that reader turning pages. The cool bonus is it also keeps you, the writer, on your toes and interested in your story, because with each scene and its sequel, which then those stack up and lead to chapters, you're building that momentum and you're keeping yourself involved in the story. Because let's face it, part of your job is to keep that story interesting and keep driving it forward. Now, does that mean it has to be conflict driven? Absolutely not. You know me, if you know anything, I am not advocating for slick Hollywood movie style conflict driven narrative. That's not my jam. I do begin with that so that we have a common point of interest in order to move forward from. But as I'm going to show you in the Zettelkasten for Fiction book and in my subsequent newsletter, There are more kinds of story around the world across cultures than you could write in an entire lifetime. I find that extremely exciting, and that's one of the things that I'm really looking forward to sharing with you, which is one of the reasons I'm doing this. I think there is a kind of story structure out there for every single writer, and I consider it one of my jobs to help you find your kind of story. So, I hope this was helpful. This gave you a little bit more of a sneak peek into how Zettelkasten research turns into cards, turns into story elements, and then how you stack up those story elements into scenes and sequels that then drive your narrative forward. With that said, I will leave you with this. Start thinking for yourself about what kind of story do you want to tell? Do you want to tell a conflict-driven story where there's a big final battle and a conclusion and a resolution? Or do you want to tell a quiet story where maybe there's just an internal character shift and the story is hallmarked by sweetness or quietness or solitude? Or do you want to write a story that's somewhere in the middle of those two things? It's entirely up to you. Our job together is to figure that out and get the words on the page. So that's it for today. I will see you back here tomorrow when we explore another aspect of writing the book, Zettelkasten for Fiction, where imagination finds order, and I continue talking and walking you through how to get your writing done. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you tomorrow.